Hi, this is Marshall Toplansky.
And Joel Kotkin.
And welcome to the Feudal Future podcast. If you're listening, it means you're interested in creating a better future, one that values diverse discussion and preserves opportunity for the middle and working classes.
This is why we started the show, to bring together ideas and people that challenge the notion of a hierarchical, socially stagnant, and centrally programmed future. Maybe you've experienced the rising costs of home ownership, diminishing job prospects, or the burden of over-regulation and increasingly censorship. This is happening in cities everywhere, and we recognize the need for new action.
For this reason, we created the Beyond Feudalism Facebook group, a place for you to connect and share resources with like-minded people. Here you'll be able to ask questions, network, and share your own stories and ideas on how we can bring opportunity and common sense back into our civil discourse and governance.
Consider this a hub for all things feudal, where we'll be sharing insights from our recent Beyond Feudalism report with Chapman University, clips and highlights from the podcast, and links to related content on topics such as housing, education, energy, transportation, and entrepreneurship. Much of our focus has been so far on California, but we expect to see this work and apply this work to conditions around the world.
Well, as you can probably tell, we're not too excited about the path we're currently on as a society, but we are hopeful for what's possible. And if we can better understand what's happening and build momentum to overcome the trends, so much the better.
So we encourage you to join the Facebook group via the link below to get involved and keep up-to-date information on all new developments. And for more information, my new book, The Coming of Neo-Feudalism, outlines everything that's happening and where we need to change. The link to that is also in the show description.
So thank you very much for tuning in, and we hope you enjoy the show.
This is Joel Kotkin.
And this is Marshall Toplansky.
And you're listening to the Feudal Future podcast. Our society is being rapidly reduced to a feudal state, a process now being exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Millions of small businesses are near extinction. Millions more are losing their jobs, and many others will be stuck in the status of propertyless serfs. The big winners have been the expert class of the clerisy, and most of all, the tech oligarchs, who benefit as people rely more on algorithms than human relationships.
With this, around the world, the middle class is becoming more squeezed than ever, and it's having profound economic, social, and spiritual implications. Here on the show, we're having conversations with business, government, and citizen leaders like you to get to the core of these issues and explore how we can work together to form a better future than the one we're headed towards. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Feudal Future podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And we are delighted today to have Kevin Shuvalov with us. Kevin is CEO and founder of Mammoth Marketing and a former RNC staffer in the George W. Bush administration days. And Kevin, welcome. We're delighted to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure. And we are doing this right after the election. And so the point of today is to really kind of look back at what happened in this election cycle and get your thoughts on it. So Joel, you want to start us off with some questions?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the things I found really interesting about this election, and actually I think we were talking earlier, very encouraging, is the fact that people seem to have gotten very selective. Here in California, and you're in Texas, of course, that, this idea that you've got these two nations and everybody's either, one block or the other, didn't turn out to be the case. Were you surprised by that? And what do you think it means?
I was very surprised. We have this very ugly spreadsheet. We were very concerned about our state house here in Texas. The Democrats, spent over $60 million to try and take it over. And on election day, we were either going to lose 9 seats, lose a few seats, but we kind of felt like we're all tied to Trump in some ways, because in the polling, it was very hard to get away from it. And then we found out, well, we ended up even, didn't gain any ground, didn't lose any ground, and Trump performed as we expected him to perform. But the voters then decided, well, we're going to become swing voters. And we've seen that throughout the country. I think the Senate, holding the Senate was just probably a shock to the system of everybody. Most people felt like it was gone. The sex scandal in North Carolina was not making any headways in the surveys. But I think in the end, what you found was you had a bunch of really close elections. And a lot of people want to blame the polls. And I would be careful with that, because they weren't necessarily that wrong. On the national race, on the presidential, they've got it. They got the side right. They may not got the margin right, but they are polls and therefore have a margin of error. So yeah, I'm completely surprised.
Were there some, you're very adept at the use of different marketing tools in the political area. Were there new tools that came out that you think may have had an impact on how things went down?
Yeah, texting is probably the newest rage. And because it is a cheap, effective way to talk with voters. I think social media still plays a role, but Facebook is really trying to push politics off their platform. Which in the long term probably brings them more pain than financial gain. Mm-hmm. And they are a media company. And so therefore you had to look for different ways to talk to voters. TV and mail are still the 2 biggest drivers in it. So then, TV and mail can only get you so far, but then you have to start picking up other ways to pick up voters. So if there was one thing, I would say it was texting. And in the year of COVID, here the Democrats all went inside and they weren't coming out. And the Republicans said, well, we'll still go door to door. We can do it safely. And people actually enjoyed it, someone to talk to in this. And so therefore, the old will always work.
It's interesting about texting too, because it is impossible to avoid seeing a text. You can avoid maybe social media posts, right? If you're
Yep.
strong-willed and you're willing to buck the laboratory experiment that Facebook has set up for us, but you can't really ignore the texts. And now, plus there's new technology that kind of makes texts not just a one-way advertising impression vehicle, but a two-way response vehicle of getting people involved in things. Did you find that worked as a technique?
Absolutely. A couple examples. One, in the height of COVID, we were using it almost to survey voters. Should the state reopen? Should the country reopen? Do we need to do this? What about schools? Picking up great information on voters and really, picking out target demographics to really talk to. And it kind of showed us where we had a party break and their favorability of the president, the governor, so on and so forth. And so it gave us a pretty good idea. Another way we use it is when we launch a commercial, we also launch it via text, to get immediate eyeballs.
Tell people that it's going to be on. Yeah, it's interesting. It'd be interesting to see how the pollsters end up using texting for short polls in more real time for the next election cycle, and whether they, can use it. There's such a lag time, and there's such a bias in the selection process for who's going to respond to a survey, that this could, since who you're sending your text out to, it would be an interesting technique.
It is. And I think, and I'm not a pollster, but I do believe there are some, sampling in that area to make sure, they're getting the right person they want to talk to, they're in the right district, yada, yada. Cell phones are still not, it's still not 100%. So, for instance,
it's getting there. Although,
we have
the
three
older folks are dying
voters.
off, right?
Yeah, we have 3 registered voters at our house, but I will get texts for my college son and my wife and myself. So I get 3 times as many.
But I think one interesting thing about Marshall brought up the text, and when you mentioned cheap, when I came up in California, writing about the California politics, this is the age of Reagan and where and there was very Jerry Brown, very sophisticated media, very expensive races. It seems to be that money doesn't buy what it used to buy politically, and that the Republicans were very seriously outspent here in California. It was ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you take the affirmative action measure here that went down, which is something worth talking about. They were outspent 10-1. So is money becoming less relevant to politics as we go towards this social media era?
No, it's not becoming less relevant. It is, but there is a point that you can outkick your own BS. And I think with the progressives, we've seen that. I mean, if you really look back at the Tea Party, what the Tea Party wanted was not out of line with a lot of the country. Stop spending, immigration, they were pretty mainstream issues. If you look at the progressives and the food fight happening amongst the Democrat Party in Congress right now, the policies they want are completely out of line with the country and completely out of line of people's ability to raise their family and hope that their children do better than them. I mean, people can see you're locking us in to a bad path. So it's a long way to say, no, money is absolutely important, but there's also efficiency. And the Democrats were not efficient. They were completely inefficient.
Yeah, they were just inundating the airwaves. It was, I'm surprised that there's no wear out factor that gets measured somehow, because I felt that the message was being repeated over and over and over and over again. It's like, okay, got to turn off the TV. This is just, I can't watch this anymore. It's too invasive in my life.
Yeah, I will tell you, one of the things I've noticed, which I think the Democrats fall for this more than the Republicans, is let's take COVID, for example. Their message was they follow science. They poll tested it. Of course they did. You're not going to spend that much money. Well, of course everyone says they're for the science. But when you dug down into the survey, people were tired of being told they had to stay at home, and they were frustrated with the process. And they were tired of government telling them how to live every aspect of their life. So therefore, while the message, yes, it worked and the Democrats ran on it, it wasn't a reason to elect them. Was what the Democrats put forth, and what they're fighting about is they let the progressives make this election about defunding the police, following the science when everyone realized it's a pandemic and this thing is torn through different parts of the country at different times, not caring what party was in charge. Any idiot could see that. But they thought that was their best path. And I don't know if you saw yesterday, Biden's science advisor or doctor advisor said, a national lockdown for 4 to 6 weeks would be good. Well, of course they made him walk that back today. I could see, President-elect Biden slapping his forehead going, are you kidding me?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a long history of people saying, yeah, I'm going to kind of ignore, my own personal needs are going to collide with whatever the scientific evidence is, and I've got to live in the meantime. So, I could see how this is going to be a difficult thing. But, at the end of the day, people rejected Trump as a person, right? As a person, largely because I think they felt as though he was being very insensitive to the science, even though they wanted to ignore the science and go out themselves. Right? They felt as though he was being like pig-headed about it. And so what do you think that means?
Well, a couple things. If you honestly look at Trump's biggest achievements, judges, tax cuts, those are classic Republican achievements. If you kind of start looking at what was Trumpian about Trump, his hardline immigration, the party had never been there, a wing of the party had. Well, I can't say that it's any better now than when he first got elected. And trade. It doesn't look like we've done anything on trade. He brought attention to some things. And I think, long term, through his, blustery, I think he has brought an attention to China that was desperately needed. I was reading something, Will Hurd, the former congressman, said, I don't believe the American people know we're in the fight of our lives with China over AI.
Right.
Yeah. The winner of this race, is vitally important. And so I would give Trump credit for that, but it was a rejection of his personality.
Yeah. It's funny. The Wall Street Journal had an article yesterday or day before that basically said Biden's strategy on China will be tougher defense, quieter offense. But still, Trump brought the need to have a more adversarial strategy up. Yeah. This was not in the previous thought, right? It was more, let's let China grow so that we can grow our own supply chain and let them, all boats lift. And I agree with you. I think this is more of a competitive game as we move toward who controls the AI.
Yes. I have a question, Kevin, which is related to this, which is if we're looking at the future, first of all, I think that when I look at the electorate as best I can, comparing 2016 and 2020, Trump lost some among older people, which I think many of them were offended by his personality. What astounds me is that he actually did better among young people and better among Hispanics and better particularly among African-American males than anyone expected. And that was particularly marked in Florida and where you are in Texas. What happened and what does that mean?
Well, I think a couple things happened. And one is may have been the craziest summer I've ever lived through. I didn't live through 68. I came along a little too late. And I think the upheaval, really scattered, the electorate. We saw Hispanics were moving early in August, and it wasn't just Trump. It was all Republicans. The Democrats were not putting out a message that was really for them. Per se, and especially in a place like Texas, where they are not, Texas, as you and I have discussed on many times, Hispanics, Latinos in Texas are just different than any other state. They're more conservative, more intertwined in society, multiple generations. They have wealth. So, I think we saw that, and along the border, they deal with those border issues every day, and they're real. And while Trump, would make a mess of them, those are real issues with real cartels and real bad people and real human traffickers down there. And that's always been the most conservative part of the Hispanic Party. It's where you get the congressmen and the state reps that they're pretty conservative guys and gals. So I think that changed. I think older people, I just really think the Democrats, Joe Biden just offered, I'm not him. It's just a return to calm without putting a message. And I think what fundamentally hurt the Democrats. It was a very smart strategy on his part. Trump could only pick at Sleepy Joe, but it allowed the progressives to kind of set the table. And the table they were setting were not good for any of those demographics you're talking about. Young males, older people. So I think there was a little bit of a natural scattering of the electorate. It'll be interesting to see going forward what happens. I don't think anything is locked in.
Well, what do you think about that from a Republican perspective? How do the Republicans rebuild now? What's the coalition look like?
Well, there's a lot of talk about that. A lot of talk saying we need to become the workers' party, and not the country club party. And I think you're somewhere in between that. Because we're not going to be the pro-union party ever. We're still going to represent small business, which is the lifeblood of America. So I think that is the greatest question. And it's really hard to answer because, to be honest, what happens? What does President Trump do? Does he become a president in exile? But he still controls, a large portion of the party through that Twitter account. Do his kids make him?
Did they let him have a smartphone in prison, or?
Well, but I will tell you that's the most interesting thing is what do the next 2 years look like? I would tell you from a Republican point of view, wow, we should be on offense. This is where you really take over the state houses and the governor's mansion, and then you build a House majority, which is really, really close. We're going into a redistricting year. We're going to control a lot of the redistricting process. I mean, this should be a time for big Republican gains.
And what one factor in the work I do on demographics a great deal, which is they'll control the states which are going to be adding Congress people. Astounding to me as a 50-year resident of the state of California, that we are going to lose a congressional seat. It never occurred to me that this could possibly happen. Texas is going to gain how many seats?
It's somewhere between 2, 4, 3, somewhere in there.
So when we look at the 2024 election, red states will actually have increased. I assume states like Florida, Tennessee,
Florida, Georgia. Yeah, the Sun Belt is absolutely going to become the political powerhouse, but with those seats come a changing population. Right. So, and Texas is not purple. We're still a red state, but we are a competitive state.
One of the things that happened, I think, that is a bellwether that Republicans could really heed as a potential shift is the approval in California, solidly blue state, of the proposition that undid the prohibition of gig economy work. Basically, Californians rejected that. They said, no, we want people to have the ability to do gig economy work, to do driving and all this other kinds of stuff, which was a rejection of classic unions. So to me, that's saying, hey, you know what? This is kind of an artifact of the younger skewing electorate. That's where I see the Republican gains potentially can be made, because basically you're talking about entrepreneurship. You're talking about supporting entrepreneurship. And I think that would be a theme that would move Republicans from country club to at least scrapping entrepreneur.
Yeah, absolutely. If we can get there, my overall concern is the leadership, right? Who takes the mantle and is driving this? It should be the governors right now, and but who knows what's going to happen in exile? Because you're absolutely right. Joel sent me the article on young males, and the one thing that article made me think about was, in this social media age, it's coming at you. Their ability to sift through information is amazing. I've got a 19-year-old son in college. He voted for Trump, but it wasn't easy for him, right? And I told him, it's like, look, you do whatever you want on the top races, but I said, follow my lead on the down ballot. And he's like, I ended up doing it, and he kind of felt that article. It's like, well, no one's looking out for me. I'm on a college campus where, I'm a bad guy just for existing. So it's really quite interesting, and I do think that's where it is. And more so, this is going to be we're not going to have the V-shaped recovery. We're just not. It's going to take a while to dig out of the virus, and that's where the entrepreneurial spirit and helping these guys. But I think Biden's team is going to move fast on the college loans, and that my fear is that will be a huge miss for.
Yeah, that'll buy them a lot of goodwill among that demographic.
Because it was a problem Obama created.
Yeah,
and we should have fixed it.
What do you see? At this particular point in time, which is mid-November, the chaos and the bitterness is still there. And the unwillingness of the Trump administration to even admit that they lost. So it tells me that we're in a very conflicted world. Who is emerging to be able to actually solve that problem? Who's stepping up to kind of basically say, okay, let's blow the whistle, let's regroup, and let's rethink the party? Where do you see that coming from, really?
I think you will see it in the coming weeks. I think there is let's give the president time and space. They've all said, look, Biden needs to have the classified briefings. We need to release the funds. Give him time and space to do this. But it's, where is that going to come from? The governors? Is it McConnell? McConnell becomes the key player now. The House is just a secondary role to a Biden administration. All negotiation is now between the administration and the Senate. And the Democrats will once again spend a lot of money in Georgia, but I don't think the American people are really going to change their mind that they really want split government. So the Republicans are going to have control of the Senate. So therefore, you have a platform. The Republicans have a platform to speak out. That's not the House, which is just a wily platform, especially on the Republican side. Democrats do a much better job.
What about an issue that I worry about a lot and written a lot about, which is, as we go forward, the control of the means of communication by people who are overwhelmingly on the opposite side of the Republican Party. Are you concerned about that, or do you think that now that Trump is gone, the oligarchs may rediscover free speech and discussion?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of concern. And they tried to show it, which I think was a complete overplay of Silicon Valley. And their super PAC spent $11 million late to try and defeat Senator Cornyn. One of the most respected, reasonable, minds in the Senate. But we do have an issue that is, we have to discuss this. We've got 5 companies that have a market cap that make up a quarter of the S&P 500, and they all control the communication channels. And this isn't new to America. We've been through this before, and we have to go through it again. And I think it's going to be ugly. These guys can, fight, but what are the Democrats going to do? I think that's going to be the key issue going forward. I think breakup talks are going to begin in DC. And I think is going to unite a lot of the Democrats and Republicans.
Well, and it's interesting that they actually started under a Trump administration.
Yeah, but what if maybe 20 years we find out, well, if it wouldn't have been for Trump, we wouldn't have realized how exposed we were to bad actors in Russia and China and Iran to really influence our elections. Now everybody knows.
Well, we shall see what happens. This is really fascinating stuff, and obviously, we can see some of the early indicators forming, but we don't know exactly where things are going. But I just want to thank you so much, Kevin Shuvalov, for being part of the Feudal Future podcast. This was fascinating, and we hope to circle back around in the future so we can touch base and see, well, how did it all come out, and get your thoughts on that.
Why?
Absolutely. Funnest part.
And I assume we all can say that 2022 will be particularly interesting because we'll have politics without the presence of Donald Trump, which will be good.
Joel, I would not be sure of that.
Or the dominant presence.
Well, it depends which Donald you're talking about.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
All right.
Guys, thank you so much.
Thank
you, Kevin.
All right. See you guys.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye-bye.